Good afternoon, everyone. Well, afternoon for me, that is. I do apologize if my voice is a little bit peculiar today. Unfortunately, the hay fever season has started for me. So, for those of you that experience hay fever, you know the magical wonder that is hay fever. Absolute hell it is. Right. So today we're going to be dealing with the seventh contradiction or supposed contradiction. We don't know yet. We're going to investigate, right? And so we're going to get stuck right in, as usual. We'll have a look at the original source. The original source here states the following. How long was the Ark of the Covenant at Abinadab's house? Right? And they are the necessary verses. And it would appear that now, because the source is meant to be sort of a concise listed version, we can't necessarily blame them for not giving details as to why this is a contradiction. So we sort of have to assume, and a lot of people, should I say, atheists that want to bring this sort of thing up, they never really explain why these things. A lot of them just sort of refer to these kinds of lists and throw it at you, but they themselves have never actually investigated it in order to know what exactly is actually going on. So we're going to have a quick squiz over here and see if we're going to suss it out. But it would appear, it seems that according to them, there might be some sort of a contradiction in how long the Ark of the Covenant was actually kept in Abinadab's house. Now, for those of you that have watched the two or three previous ones, it all has to do with the same amount of time. Abinadab, King Saul, King David, there was a time of strife, there are prophet Samuel and all that sort of thing, and we have a bit of a regime change. And so the previous ones had to do with who was Abinadab's father and who was Asa's son and so on and so forth, right? So it's rough. It all has to do with the same time period. Now, to give you just a brief background about what's going on here, right? The Bible, first of all, we need to understand the Bible is ordered. The books of the Bible are ordered in chronological order, right? So all the events from Genesis all the way to Revelation, and everything is slotted in when it happens. So this is something that we need to understand. If two different places in the Bible appear to contradict each other, it's because something might have been true earlier on, and then as things developed later, because of the developments, and a person says, well, now this is the case, and then something else is true. For example, yesterday I had £10, and then tomorrow I have £5, and some people, that's a contradiction. It's like, no, it merely means that during the time span between these two, I spent £5. It's that simple. So when we talk about the £10 and the £5, the £5 is a subset, as it were, of the £10. The £10 is how much I had in total, and £5 is what I was left with. £5 is a subset, and you get a lot of these kinds of things. So the chronology really has to be appreciated and taken into account, right? First of all. Second of all, the Ark of the Covenant. If we look at the history of Israel, before Israel had kings, they had judges, okay? And a judge is not necessarily a king, but is sort of a few rungs down, as it were. And Samuel was basically the final judge, pretty much. Prophet as well, he was. And these verses, if we go back to the verses that it's quoting, if we go back there quickly, right, we see that Samuel, right, and 2 Samuel and Acts. Okay, now Acts is obviously in the New Testament that they provide as a reference. But basically 1 Samuel tells you the story in terms of the timeline from when Samuel was born to when Samuel becomes a prophet and eventually dies. And it also includes the story of when Samuel anointed Saul, when Israel received their first king, which was Saul. And it basically discusses the reign of Saul, Saul's persecution of David, Saul's eventual death, Samuel's eventual death, and then 2 Samuel is basically about the reign of King David once Saul dies and David becomes king. And then also after anointing Saul, once Saul proved to become quite corrupt and so on and so forth, Samuel eventually anointed then David instead. and then David received the Holy Spirit, and then was meant to rule after that. And so that's basically the sort of the span of the timeline. Now, as for the Ark of the Covenant, there is what this story is about is the Ark of the Covenant ended up in Abinadab's house. The reason for this is just prior to this particular event, Israel went to war with the Philistines. Now, because Israel was really apostate and they were not doing things really proper, and God said to them, don't do this, don't do that, and they didn't listen. And in terms of arrogance and presumption, they went to war with the Philistines and took the Ark of the Covenant with them. And they got their butts kicked, and the Philistines walked off with the Ark of the Covenant. And what happened is basically they took the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in one of their pagan temples. And what they found is that they came back the following day, and the one of their pagan statues, the main pagan statues, had actually fallen over and was broken into three separate pieces. So the hands and the head and the body, right, into three separate pieces. And that's actually very interesting, but that's for another time. Very interesting typology there, right? So fallen over, and then there was a plague that went throughout the Philistine world. Some people speculate, now it might not be true what this plague was and stuff like that, but some people say that it was hemorrhoids, for example, and that's actually if you think that God doesn't have really a sense of humor, things like this kind of maybe show that he has, because sodomy was very much a part of the ancient pagan worship and stuff like that, and so to give people hemorrhoids is a little bit, I mean, you know, it's kind of amusing if you really think about it, right? You can no longer perform your pagan rituals in the full way that you want to, right? Anyway, so the Philistines eventually had enough of this, and they said, right, we need to get rid of this thing, because this God of Israel is going to be the end of us, right? So they put the ark on a cart, right, and off they send it, and then the Israelites eventually receive the ark. They take the ark, they put it in Abinadab's house. They make Eliezer and all these guys priests, and now they're going to look after the ark, and the ark's going to stay there. Traditionally, the ark was always back in Moses' time, because now they'd been carrying this thing around for quite a while, right? It was built already back in the time of Moses, and the place of the ark was always in the temple, or at least the temple in those days was a really elaborate tent that they had, and then the ark would sit in you had the holy, and then you had the most holy, and the ark would sit there, and it was the job of the priests to look after the ark and sort that out to make sure it was all well kept, and so on and so forth. So because there's no temple yet, the temple at the moment was not going to be built until the time of Solomon. King David actually wanted to build the temple. He had opportunity to do so, but God actually said to him, no, I don't want you to build it. And the reason for that, there's a typological reason for that. I know I'm verging off a topic a little bit, but the reason for that is because the kingdom of God, or the temple of God, is not meant to be established by men of violence, as it were. And David, being a warrior, an exceptional warrior, was a man of quite some violence. He was very good at violence. He was a good warrior. And I mean, it's not that his causes were necessarily unjust or anything like that, but in God's mind, and also typologically speaking, to give no one any reason that this religious system is based on coercion of any kind, he then recoiled from allowing David to build the temple, and instead saw to it that his son Solomon would eventually build the temple. And that's one of the reasons why it's there. God didn't want basically not a warlord, but I'll use the warlord for want of a better word, but he didn't want a person whose occupation was essentially soldiering to be building the temple. It sends a bad message, and it's not a message that he wants, and so on and so forth. And typologically speaking, if we think about when Christ came, the Jews expected Christ, or the Messiah, to basically be a warlord, and Jesus Christ was not a warlord, and that's one of the reasons why he rejected them. And when Christ established the Christian church, it wasn't by the sword or anything of that sort at all. He was peaceful, and he was eventually then murdered. So these themes all tie in, and so on and so forth. So that's the background that we have, right? The ark went to in Abinadab's house, and there it stayed for some time, right? And we are now going to establish how long was this actually, because that's where it seems to be the place. And the only time that the ark was actually pulled out or brought out for any reason was when David eventually became king, and then we will see that. So let's go into the verses here quickly. Let's go to the first verse. First Samuel. All right. So the men of whatever the heck that word is, right? Kirjatharim, right, came and fetched the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abinadab in the hill, right? So he lived on a hill, and sanctified Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. All right, so I went into his house, and it came to pass while the ark abode in this area, I'm not going to butcher the name again, that the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. Okay, so as far as we can tell, that at the time of writing this particular piece, now we must understand this is being written for religious purposes, so they're not going to be overly pedantic about certain details, because remember what we established about the Bible. The Bible is there for doctrine. I actually forgot about that, right? Didn't I? Right? So what again, let's establish what the Bible is for, what it says about itself. It is good for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, etc., etc., unto good works, so that the Christian individual, the Jewish individual, right, the Jewish individual back in those days, but in the New Testament times and for us today, is those things, is for religious instruction, moral goodness, and so on and so forth, unto good works, so that we can be decent people, decent Christians, and so on and so forth. And that's what the doctrines are there for, right? So if we grant that this is a contradiction, that there is a contradiction in here somewhere, would it render false what the Bible says of itself that it is for? And the answer is no, because there is no Christian doctrine. Again, there is absolutely no Christian doctrine, no moral ethic or anything like that, that suggests that hangs on how long the ark was in some guy's house, right? There's no doctrine that surrounds it. So even if there is a contradiction here somehow, for whatever reason, it does not touch the infallibility of the Bible as a preserved, as a providentially preserved piece of text that can still serve for us as a source of instruction for religious matters of faith, matters of philosophy, matters of ethics, and so on and so forth, which is specifically what it says, right? And even in the time, so if we're thinking about the book of Samuel, all the books of Samuel, if we leave out just the book of Acts, because it includes Acts, so all the books of Samuel, even Jesus, when Jesus came, and Jesus never raised any question about there being contradictions and stuff like that, because Jesus went into the temple, he read from the text and stuff like that, and Jesus himself never raised any issues about whether the texts that they had preserved were contradictory in some minor little stupid little details, was it 3 or was it 5 and all that kind of stuff. It's actually totally irrelevant for the purposes for which this particular text is for. Okay, and so that's the case. Even if it is a contradiction, it's irrelevant. Okay, so now let's establish whether it is actually a contradiction. Okay, let's go right back 20 years. And so, all right, so at the time of writing this, it had now been, because it's telling the story, whoever's writing this is looking back into the past and telling you the story. Up to this point was there for 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. So we need to understand this happens before Saul is made king. Okay, this happens before he's made king, right? So the ark comes into Abinadab's house, chills out at his house, and 20 years, right? And King Saul is not king yet, right? Saul's not king yet, right? Then the second verse that they quote again, I put actually the entire context, because this is the verse that they pull out, right? It says here, and Samuel said to the people, "See ye him who the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king, right? They only give you this verse, but this verse is entirely meaningless, all right? It's a completely idiotic verse to quote if you're going to talk about a contradiction. So to give you the background, this verse is talking about now, is actually now talking about Saul, right? Right? Israel, come near, tribe of Benjamin, right? When Samuel caused the kings of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was taken. Come near, the family Matri was taken. Saul, son of Kish, was taken. So now we're finding here that now at this point, now Saul is going to be anointed king, and they're going to make him, and now Saul's going to become the first king. All right, there we go. So you need to notice here that this says nothing about this. There is no this verse does not contradict the previous one, because it doesn't say, it's not even talking about the Ark of the Covenant. So there's no contradiction here so far, none whatsoever. It says nothing about the Ark of the Covenant whatsoever. So it's actually completely irrelevant to the discussion. Then over here, and David arose. Now 2 Samuel, right? We need to see here, right? It's in 2 Samuel. So now, and it says here, and David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baal of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts that dwelleth. Right. So remember what I said. By this point in 2 Samuel, now David is king. So quite a bit of time has passed. Right. Quite a bit of time has passed. So whatever that 20 years was, that 20 years plus, however, to the time of Saul becoming king, then Saul's kingship, his death, and now eventually David. So all that time passes, and now that David is king, he brings up the ark, right, to bring thence the ark of God. So he brings it up, and they set the ark of God upon a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in Gibeah, and Uzziah, and so on and so forth, right? So now they bring the cart. So it went in, right, just after it came back from the war after the Philistines, right, and has stayed there until David actually became king. And then at some point shortly afterwards, David brought it out, because we know that shortly after David becomes king, he then sort of sets up and gets everything sorted out with he reestablishes the priesthood, because the priesthood had actually, if you refer to the previous contradiction videos that we talked about, Saul himself had actually wiped out quite a few of the priests, right? He'd actually decimated them quite significantly, to the point that Saul, in his desperation, eventually went to consult the witch of Endor, actually went to an occult priestess in order to go and consult with her, because, you know, he had actually decimated the priesthood. And then we go to Acts now here. So again, we need to notice it says nothing here about a time period. Nothing here about a time period at all. At no point. So the first verse, it says up to this point, right, it was 20 years and all the house of, so up to this point, at no point does it say that it was there for 20 years and then was taken out. It just says at this point it was 20 years. So there's no contradiction. This verse in Samuel does not contradict. It doesn't, at nowhere does it say it was only there for 20 years or only there for 30 years. It gives you no time frame here whatsoever, right? It doesn't even, you know, at all, right? It just says when David became, so now David's king, he brought it out. Now here's where some people believe the contradiction lies, right? In Acts, so now this is all the time in Acts. So now Acts, the person who's writing the Acts of the Apostles is looking back and is giving an account, and says, and afterwards they desired a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Cis, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. So it says Saul reigned for 40 years. So but again, over here, it doesn't mention the ark at all. It doesn't say how long the ark was anywhere. So it's not a contradiction, right? It just says that Saul reigned for 40 years. That's all it says. That's pretty much all it's saying. So the idea that any of these verses directly contradict the first one is completely, it's silly. It really is silly. It seems someone's trying, either can't read, or they're just trying to be clever, or find problems where there is none. So let's figure this out and see if we can. Let's see if we can actually figure this out and come to a conclusion for how long Saul, the ark was actually in Abinadab's house. So I've done this a little bit lengthways here, right? So we can see timeline. So as I was talking before, right? The book of Samuel basically covers, if we refer back to what I was talking about earlier on, the book of First Samuel basically covers the birth of Samuel. So you've got the birth of Samuel and the death of King Saul. So the whole book deals with Samuel as a child. He eventually becomes a judge, gets anointed Saul, talks about Saul eventually dies, and then Second Samuel basically talks about, and again, this is not 100% accurate, this is for illustration purposes only, right? That's it, okay? So bear in mind, this is just to facilitate the discussion, okay? So now, and then so basically covers from when David becomes king, and then there's a little bit of overlap between the two, because David is born sometime here, right? And eventually becomes friends with Saul's son Jonathan, and then eventually ends up in the court, in King Saul's court. And then there's a time of persecution from when David is persecuted, right, and then becomes king, and then king thereafter, right? So that should actually be there anyway. So this is basically more or less what it is, right? So now at some point, okay, when we're reading the thing, the ark is lost. So I've got AL here. I hope you can all read this, right? So basically, right, let me look at it this way. So basically we have AL, okay? The ark is lost, okay? And then the ark is recovered, and it goes into Abinadab's house. And then there's some time, we don't know when, okay? When the person's talking about the thing, it says at some point here, before Saul becomes king, it had been there for 20 years. All right, 20 years, been there for 20 years. Then Saul becomes king and reigns for 40 years until he dies. Okay, reigns for 40 years until he dies. Then David takes over, right? David takes over as king, and then at some point, David takes the ark out of Abinadab's house and establishes the thing. So there's overlap and stuff like that. And during this portion over here, David is persecuted and then becomes king, right? So that's basically what it's about. So what can we extrapolate from this? What we can extrapolate is that the minimum amount of time that the ark was in Abinadab's house was 20 years, right? And the maximum amount of time that the ark was in Abinadab's house would be about 60 years plus minus, you know, give or take 5 years, about 60 years. So you've got your 20 years prior to Saul becoming sort of thing, and then a little while later Saul becomes anointed. He becomes king. He's king for about 40 years. He's got the whole persecution saga with David. He eventually dies, and then David becomes king, and then pulls it out. So this time span between the ark being received, they receive the ark, between there and there is a period of roughly, I mean, we can't tell for certain, because the aim of this particular piece of literature is not to give accurate 100% historical records, and because they had other books for that, okay? The Bible, like if you remember in my previous video, it talks about the book of the Chronicles of the Deeds of the Kings, or something like that, right? They constantly reference records, extra biblical records. So for these guys, when writing the scripture, they're not interested. They're interested in it as a religious text, not as a historical text, because they already had other texts that served that precise historical purpose, right? So that's not the point. So they're just giving you the outline story, and they're not being exact. So we don't actually receive or any information as to how long it was there. So we could say that the ark was no less than 20 years, right? No less than 20 years, and up to a maximum, I would say about 65, even maybe 70 years, give or take, right? We don't really know 100% because there are this period of time here between the between when the text is being written and Saul becoming king. We don't know how much time passes by there, and then between Saul dying and Daniel becoming king, right? And then Daniel bringing it out of Abinadab's house to reestablish the priesthood. We don't know how much time is in there either. So cumulatively, it could be added up together could be about a decade. So this could be 65, 70 years. And so reasonably, how long was the ark there for? 60 to 70 years, no less than 20, because the Bible gives us the lower limit, but it doesn't give us the upper limit at all. And none of the verses deal with it at all. And none of the verses anywhere give you an upper limit, right? They only give you a lower limit. And based on the chronology, because obviously Samuel 1, where the 20 years statement is given, is written before 2 Samuel, and written quite a while before the Acts, right? So, right, is there a contradiction? Pardon me, these allergies are terrible. Is there a contradiction? The answer is no. There is no contradiction. The person. So basically, what we have here, the atheist that put this together, is either just not reading the text carefully, is being disingenuous, completely just disingenuous. He's just looking for an excuse to be an idiot. All right. We've got perhaps a bifurcation fallacy. So he's separating things which are not necessarily meant to be split up. And similarly, we might have what we call a subset fallacy, where the atheist doesn't realize that 20 is merely a subset of the total amount of time that the ark was in Abinadab's house. And because we're not given the upper limit, this individual simply assumes that 20 is the upper limit, yet and that's why he finds there's a contradiction between that statement and then the statement for how long Saul reigned for, which was 40 years, and then only once Daniel became king, and so on and so forth, did he bring it out. So that would imply that the upper limit is obviously a lot more than merely 20 years. So subset fallacy and bifurcation fallacy are kind of more or less related to each other in this particular way, separating things which are not necessarily there. 20 merely being a subset, again separating out what 2 times 2, 1 plus 1 is 2, and so on and so forth, all these kinds of things. 1 is a subset of 2, and 4 is a subset of 8, etc. Right? It's not that complicated. And I hope that you guys realize that we're seeing a little bit of a trend here, right? Let me and here's the thing, right? Let's go back to the thing, right? I'm gonna remind you who put this together. So let's go all the way to the end, right? Who put this together, right? So here, the Reason Project, okay? So far, all of the contradictions, even though not all of them are completely and utterly idiotic, some of them are really idiotic and just not carefully researched at all, right? So this idea that something called the Reason Project would make such simple little mistakes is a bit strange. And especially if you know who Sam Harris is. Sam Harris is not an idiot. Okay? Sam Harris is he's not a dummy. He's not a dummy. He's a smart guy, right? And from what I can tell, he's a sincere guy, as from what I can tell, right? Even though he has this but he does seem to try, and we all have our biases, fair enough, but he does try to seem fair. So I don't know if he just relied on someone to give him this information, and this person somewhat and this person is less is less careful than he. I don't know, but these are not stupid people we're dealing with, and yet, or so far, I mean, we've done 7. There's 439. We've done 7, and every single one of them have just been so silly so far. Really, really silly. Not very, very difficult to resolve. Not very difficult to resolve at all. And if you had just even consulted with a historian or someone who deals in literature or anything like that, they would have told you straight away, listen, this is how you deal with the text, even if you want to be completely agnostic about it, right? So you can be agnostic about it and say, I'm not going to believe that this is inspired. I'm not going to believe that this is I'm just going to treat it like a material, in a very materialistic fashion. This is just a piece of text. We're going to assess it when you to figure it out, And a historian or someone that's trained in literature would have been able to listen. This is how we deal with these things, especially a historian, someone that tries to figure out ancient stuff. He would have told you how these kinds of things work, how you reckon these kinds of things, and would have told them straight away. Listen, you guys are attempting to push your luck here, right? And I really think they do. And one of the reasons I'm doing this particular series is not so much, I don't for a second believe that it's actually going to convince many atheists, because even if we prove that there are no contradictions, it still doesn't necessarily prove that it's divinely inspired and stuff like that. It certainly lends credence to the fact that it is divinely inspired, because how does this book remain contradiction free for thousands of years? All right, there's definitely a hand of providence involved. And for anyone that's interested, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, the Dead Sea Scrolls basically prove that the Bible is unchanged, not without contradictions, right, but unchanged in about 98% of its material, right? Perfectly preserved, right? Really, really, really wonderfully preserved. So people are really trying to be silly, and it is, well, at least I believe, well, when I started looking into these things more, to think that something like this is preserved in the way that it has been over the course of so many thousands of years, it's something that should give you pause, and gave me pause. It's like, how the heck does something, if you don't believe in providence, then how the hell do you explain that, that this thing has lasted for so long? It's ridiculous. So yeah. But anyway, like I was saying, I'm not doing this because I believe it's going to convince atheists. I mean, it might do, who knows, right? It might get an atheist to sort of step back and think, because one thing atheists accuse religious people of is taking things on faith, right? They say, oh, you believe without investigating, you're not skeptical enough. And yet, by doing this, I will show that atheists themselves, when they shout out, oh, the Bible's got contradictions and stuff like that, that they're taking it on faith, and they're just repeating what their authorities have told them, and their authorities clearly haven't done the legwork, have not done their homework, and they're basically doing what they accuse religious people of doing. Basically, is what they're doing. And for religious people themselves, obviously specifically Christians in this case, a lot of Christians themselves, because it's repeated so often that the Bible is full of contradictions and this and that, right? A lot of Christians themselves sort of tend to recoil from the idea of biblical infallibility, and a lot of them don't even understand what it means when we say the Bible is infallible. And in what way do we mean that? We mean it in a very specific way, right? They don't even know what that means, and they start losing their faith and all these kinds of things, and and they're just believing in a bunch of people who's jumping up and down, but who haven't actually done the legwork, which is a pity. It's a shame, right? But then again, it's if you're a Christian and you don't investigate properly and you lose your faith, you can't blame the atheists, right? I know a lot of people, they like to blame the atheists, this and that, and that's why we're losing faith, and blah de blah de blah. If Christians are losing their faith, it's not the atheists' fault. It's our fault, because we're stupid. That's why. Because we don't investigate, because we don't double check. So in some ways, when atheists say that we're uncritical, that we're lazy, that we don't investigate, they're actually right. Right? They're actually right. The vast majority of Christians that I know, and I know that maybe I'm talking a little bit against my own people here, but the vast majority of Christians that I know are so utterly ignorant about their own faith and what they believe and why that it's astonishing. It's astonishing. I'm flabbergasted that there is such thing that there's such thing as Christians at all in the numbers that we exist in, because the ignorance is so profound. It's unbelievable. But anyway, and that's why we're so easily deceived, because we don't know anything, and we just believe, right? And the problem with that is that a lot of Christians are simply believing without skepticism what atheists say, in the same way they believe what their pastors say, without investigation. They're believing what the atheists say without investigation, and then lose their faith, and that's a problem. That's a very, very big problem. We need to get that right. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a contradiction at all. This is silly. This is ridiculous, right? But anyway, I hope that helps you. Cheerio. God bless, and I'll spot you guys later. Take it easy. Bye.